Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Bilbo, retired burglar, an Izzet commander from The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. I've designed this deck to cost less than $40 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including the cost of shipping. And as always, the link to the deck list is in the description down below. Now let's get into this deck. So, Bilbo is a 1/3 legendary halfling rogue that costs 1 generic, a red and a blue, and has the Ring Tempts You whenever Bilbo enters or leaves the battlefield. Additionally, whenever Bilbo deals combat damage to a player, you make a treasure token. So this is a commander that wants to play heavily into the Ring Tempts You mechanic, as Bilbo himself gives you multiple instances of that keyword and actually makes for a great ring bearer. Given this mechanic is a core part of this deck, let's quickly run through what the Ring Tempts You does. So the first time the Ring Tempts You, you create an emblem called the Ring, which gains its first ability, the top of the card, and then for each following temptation, the emblem gains the next ability moving down the list on the card, while retaining the previous abilities. Each time you're tempted, you must choose a creature you control to be your ring bearer, if possible, but you don't require a creature to be tempted. Then that creature gains the abilities the ring emblem possesses so long as it remains the ring bearer. The ring bearer can be changed whenever you're tempted, and each player can only have up to 1 ring emblem and 1 ring bearer at any given time. So, the abilities that you gain in order are, first, the ring bearer becomes legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power, so this is basically a reskin of Skulk. The second temptation makes it so whenever your ring bearer attacks, you draw a card then discard a card, basically looting. The third temptation makes it so that if your ring bearer is blocked, the creature that blocks it must be sacrificed at the end of the combat phase, so kind of a version of Death Touch. And finally, if you've been tempted at least 4 times, when your ring bearer deals combat damage to a player, each opponent loses 3 life. So a kind of burn on your opponents upon combat damage. And that's all on top of the Skulk, looting, and Death Touch-like effects that your ring bearer would have already been gaining. Any further temptations beyond 4 just let you change who your ring bearer is. Now that we know what this mechanic does, let's look at the overall goals of this deck. To begin, we're going to want to speed through at least 4 instances of the Ring Tempts You as quickly as possible, as our main goal with this deck is to drain everyone with that 4th ability. We can achieve this either through cards that have the keyword the Ring Tempts You on them, as there are a decent number that were released in this set, but as we're also in blue, we can make use of flicker effects on Bilbo to get both his leaving the battlefield and entering the battlefield effects. We're also going to want to have a handful of creatures that can make effective ring bearers. We'll always have access to one, as Bilbo makes for a great ring bearer, especially early on and throughout the game, as the 1/3 with the Skulk ability makes him hard to block and kill in combat, and he has a combat damage ability. But there will still be situations where other creatures may end up being more effective. For example, a creature that naturally has double strike once we've started draining our opponents upon combat damage. And finally, we'll look into using some equipment or enchantments to give our creatures, though predominantly our ring bearer, additional keywords to make them even more effective at draining our opponents. That being said, let's actually get into the cards of our 99, and we'll start with our ramps so we can actually cast things at our decent pace. First up are Mind Stone and Liquid Metal Torque, which tap for generic. Then there's Fire Diamond and Sky Diamond, which tap for red and blue respectively, but enter the battlefield tapped. Then we have Filwar Stone, Arcane Signet, and Ornithopter of Paradise, all of which are likely to tap for whatever color mana you need. And then there's Inherited Envelope, a slightly mana expensive any color mana rock, but it also has the Ring Tempts You, which as discussed earlier is very important in this deck. Then finally we have some land-based ramp with Wayfarer's Bauble and Navigation Orb. Wayfarer's Bauble can be sacked to tutor a basic land from your library onto the battlefield tapped, and Navigation Orb has you search for 2 basic and or gate land cards, which you reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. With Navigation Orb, I'd always recommend searching for Gone Gate, which you'll have enter the battlefield tapped. And then I would search for either Sea Gate, Cliff Gate, or Izzet Guild Gate, which will go into your hand. And then for your next turn, you'll be able to play that gate, and you'll have 2 untapped dual lands. Now, let's move on to the cards with our main mechanic, the Ring Tempts You. Most of these cards will also fit into later categories, kind of like how Inherited Envelope fits here but isn't ramp. But let's start with some creatures with Rohim Lancer, which tempts you when it dies, Relentless Rohim, which tempts you when it enters the battlefield, and Rangers of Ithilien, which tempts you upon entering the battlefield. Rangers also lets you yoink a creature with lesser power than Rangers, so 2 or less, so long as Rangers of Ithilien is under your control. Then, for sorceries and enchantments, we can start with Ranger's Firebrand, Breaking of the Fellowship, and Fiery Inscription. Ranger's Firebrand deals 2 damage to any target along with Tempting You. Breaking of the Fellowship has you make a creature an opponent controls deal damage equal to its power to another creature that player controls, along with the Ring Tempting You. And Fiery Inscription tempts you upon entering the battlefield, and it deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. Then we have Soothing of Smeagol and Glorious Gale, the former returning a non-token creature to its owner's hand along with the Ring Tempting You. And Glorious Gale is a creature counterspell that, if done on a legendary spell, will have the Ring Tempt You. So a little more specific to get tempted, but there's usually a decent number of legendaries running around in Commander, at minimum with the commanders themselves. Finally, we have Birthday Escape, which replaces itself with card draw and then tempts you, and Dreadful as the Storm, which makes a target creature a 5/5 until the end of the turn, then the Ring Tempts You. Now, since Bilbo has the Ring Tempts You when he enters or leaves the battlefield, flicker effects can be an efficient way of getting ring temptations when you apply them to Bilbo, likely in your post-combat main phase, as you get 2 temptations for casting 1 card. To start, we have Essence Flux and Siren's Ruse, both basically being vanilla flicker effects in this deck, exiling a target creature and returning it under its owner's control. As spoilers, we have neither spirits nor pirates in this deck. Then we have Blur, Displace, and Ghostly Flicker. Blur is a basic flicker effect, but it replaces itself by having you draw a card as well. Displace has you flicker up to 2 creatures you control. Then Ghostly Flicker is a little different, as it has you exile 2 artifacts, creatures, and/or lands you control, and then return them under your control, which in most situations will just be a flicker, but provided I understand the rules correctly, there is one fun thing you could do in this deck if you get a super lucky draw. And that is, if you steal a creature with Rangers of Ithilien, then use Ghostly Flicker on the thing you stole, making it change zones. When it returns, the creature you stole is a new object with no recollection of ever being stolen in the first place, so if Rangers is dealt with, you'll still be keeping whatever creature you stole until it's killed or the opponent who originally controlled it leaves the game. Alright, so now that we've gone over ways that we can be tempted by the ring, let's look at some creatures that can make good alternative ring bearers to Bilbo. First up we have Gateway Sneak, which is a 1/3 similar to Bilbo, which will make good use of the Skulk-like effects from the first temptation. And additionally, when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. It does gain unblockable if a gate entered the battlefield under your control, but there's only a couple gates in this deck, so it's not exactly a reliable source, and the Skulk should have it get through frequently anyway. However, we also have Invisible Stalker, which is a 1/1 with hexproof and unblockable, which would make it really difficult to deal with if you made it your ring bearer. Next up we have some creatures that naturally have Double Strike, which when combined with the ring's Skulk, will make it very likely that at least 1 instance of combat damage will occur even if that creature is blocked. First, we have Twin Scroll Shaman, Two-Headed Cerberus, and Raging Redcap. All are 1/2s with Double Strike and have 3 converted mana cost. But we also have Markov Blademaster and Gimli of the Glittering Caves, both with Double Strike. Markov Blademaster gains +1/+1 counters whenever it deals combat damage to a player, and Gimli gains +1/+1 counters whenever another legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, and it makes treasure tokens whenever it deals combat damage to a player. Next we have Book Devourer and Embermaw Hellion, both 4/5s with Trample. Book Devourer additionally gives you access to a partial, personal wheel-like effect, as when it deals combat damage, you can discard your hand and draw that many cards. Note that this is a May ability though, so if you like your hand, you don't have to get rid of it. And Embermaw Hellion has other red sources you control deal 1 extra damage whenever they deal damage to a permanent or a player. Now finally, we have Professional Facebreaker, a 2/3 with Menace, and whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token, and sacrifice a treasure, exile the top card of your library, you may play that card this turn. Now granted, having 2 power makes this a little bit less attractive to be the ring bearer itself, but it does have higher toughness, which makes it hard to kill when it is blocked, and the fact that Professional Facebreaker doesn't need to deal combat damage itself to make treasure is great, and gaining access to some card advantage through that treasure will come in handy throughout games. Now let's look at some spells that will help make our ring bearer even more effective. First up are some ways of granting Double Strike, starting with Fire Shrieker, an artifact that simply grants Double Strike. Then there's Brass Knuckles, which makes a copy of itself when it's cast, and gives double strike provided the equipped creature has 2 or more equipment on it, so either both brass knuckles or a brass knuckle and another equipment. We also have Lizard Blades, which enters the battlefield as a 1/1 double strike creature, but can be reconfigured into an equipment that grants double strike. Then we have Blood Mist, an enchantment that lets you choose a creature you control to gain double strike for the turn at the start of your combat phase. And finally, we have Rage Reflection, an enchantment that grants all of your creatures you control double strike. Next up, we have Basilisk Collar and Quiet as Spike, both granting Death Touch, and making it even less likely that someone will block your Ring Bearer, as one of the main weaknesses for Skulk-like effects are things like walls with no power but high toughness. But Death Touch would make blocking with even a wall unattractive. And if you've already reached 3 temptations from the ring, Death Touch is always useful on one of your other non-ring bearing creatures as blockers. Basilisk Collar also grants lifelink, and Quiet as Spike has the player who took combat damage from its equipped creature lose half their life rounded up. So it combined with Skulk can make for a really painful combo to go up against. And finally, we have some methods to make our creatures even harder to block, starting with Trailblazer's Boots, which grants non-basic land walk, and given the prevalence of non-basics in Commander, this to me pretty much reads unblockable. However, there are some actual unblockable effects with Aqueous Form and Whisper Silk Cloak, the former being an aura that also lets you scry whenever the enchanted creature attacks, and the latter is an equipment that also gives Shroud, which may take a little bit of working around as it makes it completely untargetable even for you. Now, while we can rummage a bit deeper into our decks with the Ring's looting ability, it's not really filling our hands. So let's look into some spells that won't have us discard the same number of cards that we're drawing. First up are Rogue's Gloves and Thieving Magpie. Rogue's Gloves lets you draw a card when its equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, and as our Ring Bearer is chosen to be evasive, and our deck's main goal is done through combat damage, you should be able to achieve that quite frequently. And Thieving Magpie itself is an evasive creature with flying, and it's a 1/3, which actually makes it a pretty decent Ring Bearer, that also has you draw when it deals combat damage to a player. We also have some one-off draw spells with Foresee, Thoughtcast, and Silver Scrutiny. Foresee has you scry 4, then draw 2. Thoughtcast has you draw 2, but has affinity for artifacts, which can help you lower that mana cost. And Silver Scrutiny is an X-cost draw spell that can help you draw a bunch at once. We then have some creatures which can be tapped to draw cards with Archivist, Mercurial Chemister, and Arcanus the Omnipotent. Archivist can be tapped to draw a card, Mercurial Chemister can be tapped with 1 blue mana to draw 2 cards, and Arcanus can be tapped to draw 3 cards. The Bath Song is a saga that has you draw 2, then discard 1 for its first 2 turns, and then its final turn has you shuffle any number of cards from your graveyard into your library and gives you 2 blue mana. Then finally we have Thought Reflection and Teferi's Ageless Insight. The former has you draw 2 cards whenever you would normally draw 1, and the latter doing the same, but for every draw except the first. While this isn't exactly direct draw, both of them turn the Ring's looting effect into draw 2, discard 1, ensuring at least 1 extra card in hand per turn, as you'll pretty much always be swinging with your Ring Bearer, along with all the other potential instances of draw that these cards will double. Now let's look at some ways that we can interact with our opponent's boards. We can start with Lightning Bolt, which for 1 red mana lets you deal 3 damage to any target. We also have Byforce, an X mana spell that lets you destroy X target artifacts. Negate lets you counter a target non-creature spell. And Stern Scolding lets you counter a target creature spell with power or toughness of 2 or less for 1 blue mana, which might seem limiting, but a lot of powerful utility creatures have one of those values at 2 or less. This can also include some really powerful commanders such as Yawgmoth, Chulane, Gearson Starn, and Prosper, just to name a few. Then, for a couple of general counterspells, we have Counterspell and Cancel. And finally, we have a couple of board wipes in case someone gets out of hand with Spectral Deluge and Devastation Tide, where Spectral Deluge returns opponent's creatures with toughness equal to or less than the number of islands you control, and can be foretold for a reduced cost, and Devastation Tide returns all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. But now that we've gone through all of our spells, let's go over our lands. To start, there are those gate lands that were mentioned earlier, Gone Gate, Sea Gate, Cliff Gate, and Izzet Guildgate. Next we have a couple of Scry lands with Crystal Grotto and Temple of Epiphany. Then we have Izzet Boilerworks, a bounce land that taps for blue and red. Rogue's Passage taps for generic, but can make a creature unblockable for the turn. Then we have Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Myriad Landscape, with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse being reskins of each other, letting you sack them to search your library for a basic land which enters the battlefield tapped. And for 2 mana, Myriad Landscape can be tapped and sacked, letting you search your library for 2 basic lands of the same type, which enter the battlefield tapped. And finally, we'll fill our deck with 14 islands and 10 mountains, due to this deck having a slight lean towards blue spells over red. And now that we've gone over our entire deck, let's look at that price. And as you can see, at the time of recording, this deck costs a bit under $39, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each. Now I'd like to go over some potential upgrades to consider. We have some additional double strike cards with Berserker's Onslaught and Embercleave, the former giving our attacking creatures double strike, and the latter is an equipment granting +1/+1, trample, and double strike, and it goes directly onto a creature and can be cast at instant speed. We also have Deep Channel Mentor, which gives our blue creatures unblockable, though admittedly that only affects about half of our creatures. And finally we have some alternative board wipes with Evacuation, which returns all creatures to their owner's hands, and Blasphemous Act, which deals 13 damage to each creature. Regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, play with, or upgrade this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.